If you have ever tried to work on a website or select a logo, colors, what fonts to pick, all the branding stuff, you know how tricky that can be. And here at the Bite Shop, we recently underwent a whole entire rebrand, including a new logo, fonts, colors, our new website, including the landing page for my brand new business course, Create Your Career. And I learned so much in the process from our designer who we got to work with, Emily Day. She is the owner of Good Day Design Co. And I thought that there might be a chance that you find yourself working on maybe your new portfolio website or a blog, that I thought it'd be helpful to share some of Emily's wisdom with you. So that's exactly what we're doing here today. Little something different. This is a longer form interview because I wanted to get as much of her insights and her brains into your hands as possible. I hope this conversation inspires you and gets you excited to start working on your website. You know, the word branding, I feel like it gets thrown around, but there's not necessarily, I think there's a lot of misconceptions maybe around it. So what, in your mind, what is branding? What does that represent, and kind of what you do in regard to branding?
At its core, I think branding is, and I think a lot of people understand branding to be like your visual identity. But I think where some of the mistakes are is that it ends there at a logo, and that's the visual identity. But I would say that branding goes much, much further than that it's kind of every touch point that you're having with your audience, in the hopes that you're attracting people that want to be attracted by you, right? So it's not something that I feel like also can sometimes have some sort of underhanded feelings to it, that it's like everybody is a consumer, so you might as well be consuming from the people that you want. Therefore, you want to reach the people who you want to make that connection properly, I would say, and then it's a win for everybody. So from your logo, I would say there's like your color palettes, your font choices are huge. Those communicate a lot, but also just the tone that you're putting towards everything. If you're highly serious versus very, very playful, somewhere in between, those kinds of adjectives that you use to describe yourself and your business, I think are the same ones you would want your clients to be using to describe you. And that overlap, I think, is kind of like where your branding can shine.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that was what was so interesting to me through the process of working together, because I really had never gone through what you took us through, really sort of like exploring who we are. And I mean, I remember like all the conversations we had early on and the questionnaires and things that I'm like, I've never thought about that. But what was so magical to me is then when you kind of first revealed the branding to us, it was like, oh my gosh, that's totally me. And I don't even think I knew visually what that looked like, but that you were able to interpret that. So, what really helps you to get a handle, again, like I still don't know totally how you took my words and you turned it into something visually that I'm like, that's 100% like what I was looking for. And I didn't even know I wanted. So how do you kind of go from that translation of getting that sense and being able to manifest that visually?
So that's probably the most challenging part, but also it's one of the funnest parts. So I think too, in the more like social media age that we're in, and where like everybody is a brand and everything is a brand, like that's also where I think some confusion can come in, because one of the more important things with your branding, I think, is that it is reflecting the audience that you want to find. But in addition to that, like the next part of that story, a lot of the people I'm working with, it's like they are their business to some degree. Like it is both a personal brand with the very specific purpose of like promoting the business services that you have. A lot of the time with branding, you have to walk a kind of fine line of being aware of what your personal likes and dislikes are, and not letting that steer, because it's like if that's going to alienate your audience, then it would be a no.
Like, what
But
would be an example of that? That's something that, like, maybe in consideration of our branding, what would we have maybe done differently that would have been alienating to our target audience?
having things be too personal
Mm.
that you hold really tightly, like something that you sketched out once, or that a family member sketched out once, or something along those lines that you're like, we love this and it means a lot to us.
Yes.
And it's like, that is so nice and it is so special, but it might not mean anything to anyone else, right? And if you're playing too close to yourself and your preferences, it might be fine, but it might not mean anything to anyone else. I mean, it happens a surprising amount that people have drawings that they're like, this, we really want this to be the logo. And it's like, okay, let's just talk through why, because sometimes it does work. Sometimes it's a good answer, but you kind of need to talk through why and then how that's going to translate. And you kind of want to think long term of, in 5 years, is this going to feel as good to you as it did when this was like a tiny little like seed of a dream, when it's like, we want this seed of a dream to grow and we want this to grow with you. So kind of like just betting on yourself that this is going to go beyond your kitchen table, where I am, or your garage, or your small home, whatever it is, just that you're going to have that professional room to grow.
But it reminds me of the idea that sometimes we get so attached to, like, in photography, we want to incorporate a specific prop because it's like, oh, I really love this prop, or I just bought this prop and I want to put it in there, but it just like, it feels forced. It feels too much. It doesn't feel natural. There's that quote about, as a writer, you have to kill your darlings. Like, you can't get too attached. And so it sounds like in branding, it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah, I would say it's always should be audience first, something that you feel confident using to represent yourself as a close second, but still want to make sure that no matter what, you're reaching the right people. So if you have to shave off a few of the personal like affects because of that, then it just means you can reach more people.
Well, and thinking about, you mentioned fonts, and I feel like my mind was opened up to the world of fonts in working with you. That, I always sort of knew I didn't know a lot about fonts because I'm like, I know I'm not doing this right, but
Yeah.
as far as from a personality standpoint, as far as the serif and the sans serif, right? Like, that was my big breakthrough and educational moment working with you. Is so in the comparison of those two, like, how do they communicate differently, or what would they connect with in terms of audience and consideration of like those bigger categories of font types?
Serif and sans serif definitely tend to have like tendencies of their own. Serif fonts, which have the like kind of feet at the bottom, they tend to be a more like traditional style, like Williams Sonoma. That would be a good example, like something that's like a little bit more classic. Traditional is usually like the lane that you would start at for a serif font. A sans serif font usually tends to be a little bit more modern, sleek, streamlined, might all be words that you would use to describe sans serif just in general. But where some of the personality I think comes in is it tends to be helpful to have 2 to 3 fonts within your own branding. And when you do, you want some degree of variety within those so that they have good contrast and that they don't blend together where they just look a little bit not as intentional. Having one of each tends to be a good idea, as well as a body font. So a sans serif and a serif, which one you use for your subhead, which one you use for your heading, that tends to be what steers some of the direction. For the bite shot, the sans serif font is like semi bold. So I think that plays into like the bold, like pop feeling of the website all in all. But the serif font is actually almost exclusively used in italics on the website, which is another thing that you can play with. That I think is what makes it a little bit more playful. Like, it brings in some of the like diner sort of feel and style that goes along with our whole food and like breakfast theme. And it just brings in a little bit of softness. So, and there's literally like, I would innumerable fonts out there probably because more just are added all the time. But
Yeah.
and so you can go down a real rabbit hole when you're looking. But that's kind of, I think, what your starting point would be, knowing that because there are so many, there are serif fonts that can read as really, really contemporary when applied the right way. But certainly, yeah, a little bit more streamlined for sans serif and like traditional.
I think the other really fun thing in this process was, and maybe some of this too is because of your experience having worked with so many photographers and that being a part of your design background is an understanding the photography world as well. But I felt like some of the magic of what we were able to create together in this website was really that collaborative nature of the design and the photography working together. And so, folks who are sort of like thinking of, they're going to be building their websites or working with a designer, like, is it really start with the design and then you decide on the photos, or do you start with the photos and then it begets the design? How does that process usually work?
I would say no matter what, it starts with your photos because that's going to be our baseline no matter what, because they already exist. And one of the unique things I think with the Bite Shot website that we got to do is so very often with photographers, I mean, we're showcasing the portfolio that exists. It's a little bit not as practical to say like, hey, could I get a couple in wedding attire tomorrow so that we can style this the way that I would like for this little part on the homepage? I mean, photographers, of course, have styled shoots all the time. And so you can do that. You can go about it that way. But one of the things I think we really got to do was say, like, we want to have a photo like this here. And then, like, bam, you were on it. So I think one of the magic pieces that happened was having that door opened where we weren't strictly showcasing client work that you've done and like strictly showcasing portfolio work.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking outside of the box, that's one thing I would suggest doing, is maybe just saying like, where is there room to go beyond like the last summer's top 45 photos, like how can we break this out a little bit so that you make sure your style is like 100% in there, and maybe it's something that stands out a little bit beyond what's on your Instagram feed, some pieces where you're giving a little extra.
Yeah. Well, because I think in this process too, we had our conversations and we had a good solid idea and the initial branding rolled out. But then I saw the photos, some of my existing photos from my existing collection in the branding. And I was like, oh, like in terms of like the website architecture, sort of like mock-ups. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, I need to, like, I all of a sudden as a creative and the photographer was like, oh no, now I know what I want. And yes, this design is wonderful, but I need to go make some new photographs that are going to fit and be cohesive with this. And I think the beauty for us as food photographers is like, there was one point that suddenly we're all like, oh my gosh, it's breakfast. Breakfast is the homepage. Like we had this like aha moment. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, we got waffles, and because I think it started with I'd had that waffle photo and you beautifully placed it up at the upper right, and we're like, oh my God, okay, now where do I find donuts and coffee and all these other things? And so I can go get donuts. And I think it was literally like that night I was like, all right, here we go, donut, let's make this happen. And it was really fun. Then I think a new style for me sort of emerged as a result of this creative process working together. So thank you for informing my my visual aesthetic, because I think you had quite an effect on it.
Oh, well, I love that.
Well, it was really fun. And I think that's also the power, a lot of times talking to photographers, they're like, well, where do I find inspiration and where do I find new ideas? And I think that so many times for me, it always comes back to working with other people, and especially creatives who are not necessarily doing the same exact thing you're doing. So for me, whether that's a stylist or that's in your case, a designer, that can really dislodge some creativity there and help you find a direction. So thank you for that. So now, interesting thing you mentioned as far as the color perspective, And this was something that I had not thought of before, but it's so obvious to me now. And I learned a lot about color through this process. And I prided myself on having a certain knowledge of color and color theory, but it was so interesting to understand color from the standpoint of user experience.
Mhm.
So not just as an expressive element, but how it's experienced. And so like you're talking about how the yellow can be challenging, you know, and I'm over here like, let's turn up the saturation. And it's like, maybe turn it a little down. So in consideration of somebody selecting colors and thinking about that, are there common pitfalls in the color department that people should be mindful of?
There's so much around like color psychology and like blue is calming and like yellow can be alarming, kind of like it's kind of like a caution color, like orange and yellow can be caution colors, all of which, yes, there's color theory and color psychology for a reason. But I think with this yellow, honestly, this is like case in point. It doesn't have to determine like these colors are off limits. You shouldn't use this in your branding. You just want to be really thoughtful about the colors that you're combining. Like, are they pleasing to the eye?
Mhm.
That's probably a good question. But then also, are they having the effect that you want? Some of which I think is gonna subconsciously land with most people. Like a lot of the color palettes that I work with actually tend to be more like neutrals, more earth tones. So this was like a special treat for me that the goal was bright, energizing. I would say a really good practice is just always being really intentional about the words that you're using to describe everything, because just by saying those words like throughout our process of bold, bright, energizing, that it's like no matter what, that's probably going to bring to mind something quite different than like calming, soothing, understated. And if you like start with those words and you nail those down and you're like, we know at least this is us, it's
Mhm.
going to at least be easier to know what isn't you. If
Mhm.
you're a calming, understated sort of brand, you're probably not going to have bright yellow
Yeah.
as your primary color. But if
Not
you're
subtle.
bold and energetic, then that's fair game. So it helps you know what to not do, as well as when things start to land, you start to know why, even if you don't have this huge background in color theory.
Yeah. And so it does though require you to have a certain amount of knowledge of who you are and who you're trying to reach. It sounds like doing that work ahead of time to sort of reflect on, well, who am I? Like you know, as a photographer, for example, like, well, who am I really serving? So, you know, am I serving young families, or am I serving, you know, high-end food products, or, you know, who are those target clients and what resonates with them? I think that's what that all sounds like it comes back to.
Yeah, because that's the only answer that'll stay the same each time. And the only one that you'll continue to compare and say, like, does this go back to that? And if you say yes, then you're in good shape.
So, as far as the thing that was also really interesting to me in this process is that there was you, and then there was also Josh Foley, who's the developer, who's I imagine he's in some sort of tower somewhere, like madly doing all sorts of amazing technical things. He's the one who is effectively implementing the designs into the actual WordPress platform. Can you kind of explain a bit, because this was not something I was aware, that those were kind of two separate entities in my brain, like the design of the website is always the person also building it, but that wasn't the case here. And I think that was a benefit in our case, that you were able to individually focus on the things you were good at. But what, as far as like the nuances of the difference between a designer and a developer, where do those lines divide?
Sometimes they overlap.
Mhm.
So just so everyone knows, it's like there are plenty of developers who are designers and designers who are developers, but that person has two roles, I
Mhm.
would say, when they overlap, because the developer's skill set really is in knowing how to code generally in WordPress. Like that's probably the platform that developers are using most frequently. Designers are focused really solely on the visuals. So whereas I was like, this font should be one size smaller, Josh would say, okay, but would probably have no feelings about the font size outside of that. And I would not know how to change the font size. So I was really the driver behind all of the aesthetics, at least some of the navigation pieces and how people will see the user experience really and the user interface. Whereas Josh was implementing it and making it, I mean, my portion was I designed everything in Figma. So my portion ended with a Figma site, which without Josh would never be anything. It's just a file.
Yeah.
So without him, that's kind of like where my role ends. Good workarounds if someone is making their own site. I think there's a lot of great platforms where the designer is the creator of the website, like Squarespace, like a lot of user driven platforms. But if you're going on a custom site, it tends to work really well unless you are someone who has those overlapping skill sets, to have one solely visual person and one solely technical person, and together everything ends up working really smoothly, swimmingly, ends up well.
Awesome. Yeah. As far as, from you mentioned, folks who are building themselves, which I mean, that was the majority of the websites that I've had have always been, I've done I did a Squarespace and I've done some WordPress and figured that out. What are some of the pitfalls to be aware of in building your own? Because absolutely you can, and that's a great place to start. And so, what would be your advice to somebody who's going down that road of things to just be mindful of?
One thing I would say is with your verbal content, probably less is more. So if you're brainstorming, you just want to get it all out, go for it. Like write down your story, write down your services, and just be aware, be mindful that people are arriving at your website to learn what you do, learn how to contact you, see some examples of what you do, like get a sense of who you are. But they're not there to read, your life story. They just want a really good overview. They want it to be professional. Hopefully it stands out a little bit from your competitors. So keep an eye on what competitors are doing, have a sense of what's expected in your industry. And also, I usually suggest looking for examples outside of your industry that resonate with you so that your example stands out a little bit, so that you are basing some of what you're doing on something outside of that box. But yeah, a little less is more. And just an actual, like, very practical point would be, it is not normal for people to think in headlines and subheadlines. So just making sure you break up your text goes a really long way, so that you're not just asking for people to read a paragraph and then a paragraph and then a paragraph.
Yeah.
Make sure you're breaking it up enough that if they only read a headline, they're getting something out of it. And you can gain a lot by just observing other websites, like with a critical eye. That's the other thing I would say, is that everybody's on websites, everybody's seen the internet, right? But you're not usually looking at it with very critically. So once you jump into your own website, if you just kind of like take off running, it's going to be what you imagine. Just go back to some sites that are doing it well and say, like, what are they doing? And if you just pick it apart a bit, you'll see, and then you'll be able to recreate it to some extent.
But yeah, where do you like to go look for, like, if somebody was going to go, oh, where do I find inspiration? Or are there some like good avenues to start looking or Googling?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Pinterest. I use Pinterest to organize all of my projects when I'm in the finding inspiration phase. So if anyone hasn't like gone down that rabbit hole, I would suggest it. It's a good one, honestly. And once you have, again, kind of your primary words that you're coming back to, if you're just searching for calming logo or soothing spa brand, because you know that's the feeling you want to get to. Once you start down that route, and once you find, I don't know, 2 to 3 from searching that you like, then it will keep populating similar results. And I think that helps you hone in on some similarities so that you go kind of like from up here to much more honed in. So in an internet sense, definitely suggest Pinterest. It's far more curated than if you just like hop into Google. And the whole point are attractive photos. So your starting point is really strong. But I actually do a lot of work at Barnes and Noble. Like I take my computer there and will do inbox for an hour, and then when I need a break, just walk around. And that's also really great because when you're looking for inspiration, I think at that time you're in like a sponge sort of moment. So if you see a book cover that you like, think about why you like it for a minute. That's going to keep ideas sparking, and I think it's a helpful place.
So thank you so much to Emily and Josh for the beautiful website. If you want to find out more about both of them, I've got both of their info linked down below. And so with that, I hope you have a fantastic day. You stay out of trouble, and I'll see you soon. All right? Bye.